Thanks everyone for tuning in to check out our podcast today, Maker Connect. My name is Matt Despins, and I'll be your host for the show. With me today, we have Marcos Mendez, who's a partner here at the firm. And also today, we have our guest, Curt Richtermeyer. By the way, Curt, please feel free to tell me if I mispronounce that when you're chatting. Curt is currently the Chief Revenue Officer at Fourth, and no doubt has some stories, expertise, and opinions to share. So, Curt, if you're open to it, I love to start by asking you to tell us just a little bit about your career and your background so the listeners can get just a flavor of your negotiation experience. Also, maybe you can let us know at what point in your career did you discover the importance of negotiations and start to actually take it seriously. So, Curt, we're extremely excited to have you here with us. And with that, I'll turn it over to you to brag about yourself for a minute. Listen, it's the host who's making a specific request that you brag, so your humility will remain fully intact. So with that, I will turn it over to you, sir.
Thank you, Matt. It's a pleasure to meet you and to join the podcast, Marcos, as well. Thanks for inviting me. My name is actually pronounced Richtermeyer if you're in the States. Richter
Okay.
like Steel and Meyer like the wiener, as a friend of mine used to say. Here in Germany, you would pronounce it Richtermeyer.
Okay.
So I've had a fairly long career in the software industry. I actually started as a software engineer, and this was pre days of packaged software products, where I mostly lived as a traveling consultant inside of other people's companies, building custom software products for them. As I grew and as the market changed, I began to run services teams and lead services teams. And it was around this time that I began to truly recognize kind of the importance of at least being able to negotiate contracts and get good rates, and convince people why they should use my people, and have fair contracts and so forth. But it wasn't really until a little bit later on in life that I truly understood the importance of kind of building mutually kind of win-win type contracts with my customers, but more importantly, building contracts that were durable over the long period of time, that I knew that these types of relationships would have to endure. And that was when I really began to kind of take it seriously, study a lot about it, try and figure out how I could improve my approach to doing things, and look for ways to kind of develop these long-term positive relationships that are built on contracts with customers. And so that started, roughly around the late 90s when I started that. And just kind of since then, I've been involved in a number of different types of companies, many of whom have had a myriad of very complex contracts, everything running from, absorbing large software companies that we acquired that had thousands of customer contracts that we had to rework, rebuild, reprice, do all those kinds of things, all the way through to negotiating and developing multi-year, tens of millions of dollars, worth hundreds of millions of dollar type contracts with very, very large, complex organizations. So I've had the opportunity to see just about every kind of at least software and partnership type contract that exists out there, and it has given me a great deal of insight into what works, what doesn't work, what tends to last, and what tends to cause problems downstream.
Wow. I mean, what a robust body of work. Truly impressive. Speaking about companies and complex contracts, I can see here too, looks like you were with a small little company. What are they, Oracle? I mean, something like that.
Yeah.
I think Oracle might know just a thing or two about complicated contracts as probably a number of these other employers that you've been with do. Yeah, very, very impressive. Marcos, one thing that Curt touched on that actually, we haven't heard thus far on the podcast. We talk about the relationships a lot, but he talked about the durability of a contract, which honestly, we haven't heard that yet. Very, very, very unique. So when the Maker Group is talking to folks about durability and positioning, How does that factor into to your trainings and teachings?
Curt, I love that you mentioned that word, durable contracts. Whether it's a term durable, sustainable, whatever you want to put on it, I think it's an interesting concept. And when we advise our clients and we're talking about durability or sustainability of a contract, the two pillars we lean into that help make something durable is mutually aligned decisions on how we're going to work through challenges in the future, like what happens when things go bad and what are the mechanisms to correct them, as well as what happens when things go really good and one side maybe feels like that is coming a bit more in their favor. So a lot of it we call, future proofing in agreement, thinking about those either challenges or problems or incentives or rewards that you can bake in that make both sides feel really good about the ongoing durability of it. So, Kurt, I'm curious on just your perspective on seeing all those types of agreements. What types of levers or mechanisms or clauses have you seen included that help address either the problem space or the reward and upside space?
Sure. Yeah. So, it's a probably a topic that we could talk about for a long time. On the protection side of things, that is actually quite a bit more complex because it depends very much on the type of contract you're trying to negotiate. What I have found in the software world, and I'm sure that a lot of your clients are people in the software world. What I found is that a lot of software contracts don't deal with the problem of separating the software from the services associated with that software. And what they try and do is they try and deal with remedies. They try and deal with kind of how do I remediate some sort of a conflict between us in the future through the same exact mechanism. And that mechanism tends to result in some sort of breach of contract. And it's actually a really bad mechanism for both parties, to be honest with you. Because in most cases, if you're talking about complex enterprise software, you're probably talking about something that both sides have made a very large investment in getting to the point that it's installed, being used. It may have a mission critical function for the business. And if it's not working the way that you want it to, there are kind of a handful of things that cause that. And one of them is software wasn't configured properly. So there wasn't enough due diligence done up front to understand how the business needed to use it, and therefore it's not using it properly. That is the type of problem that actually tends to be caused by both sides, right? The customer who needs to use it has a responsibility to help the people who are going to deploy it understand what it needs to do, how it needs to work in order for them to run their business. And as a result of that, I tend to not want to have remediation for that kind of a problem be breach, right? That should be instead, it should be rework or more due diligence, more diligence on both parties to be able to understand what it needs to do and to test that. And you kind of go through an endless cycle of fixing that. The other problem tends to be, does the software actually do what it's supposed to do? In the world of enterprise software, every enterprise software company produces documentation that says, this is what our product does. And when a company goes through and buys that software, it is incumbent upon the buyer to say, does the software do the stuff that I need it to do, right? If it's published that it does these things, is that what I need? Now, if the software doesn't conform to that, that should be a breach, right? If it doesn't do what the company says it does, that should be breach. If it does do what it says it does, but you wanted it to do something else, that's not breach. That's not our fault. That's actually the fault of the buyer who didn't do enough due diligence. And so I think you have to be really careful how you negotiate that, because those are really sticky points. They're complicated topics for people who are not in the software world, working with software, trying to deal with this. And so you have to do a lot of work on the relationship. You have to do a lot of work helping to educate them on the kinds of things that can occur downstream. You have to do a lot of work helping them understand what you've done to date to get to the state that you're now negotiating this contract and why it's important for us to provide different kinds of protections for what we're trying to do downstream. So that kind of solves a complicated problem. The side of incentives, talk a lot about incentives.
Mm-hmm.
That's a completely different thing. I've been in just countless discussions with customers where they believe that the software product, when put in place, is going to deliver potentially a huge amount of value for them and maybe for their customers. Maybe they're going to use it for their customers. And I have never failed to see a customer bring up the idea of a mutual kind of share in the joint value type of a proposition. And what's really interesting about that is that it always sounds great to talk about doing that, right? I'll sell it to you really cheap. We'll deploy this thing together. You go sell whatever it is to your end customer, and we'll share in the value that they derive from it. What I typically find, however, is that those contracts are extremely hard to administer. And most large corporations, at least we're selling to the Fortune 500 or so, they've been down this path before. By the time you get to the procurement people that are going to negotiate this, they'll have nothing to do with this kind of a contract. So he's going to bring it up, start it in this place, but you ultimately land on, why don't we just buy the stuff that we need? And if there's value that we derive from it, we will keep all of that value. And if there's not, then we'll cancel our contract with you.
And so it sounds like we're talking about like setting expectations, making sure communicating ahead of time, kind of where we're coming from, and also having a really clear understanding of kind of where our levers are, right? Like what the things are that we're willing to be flexible on. And like you pointed out, the types of deals that maybe in theory sound good, but in practice really don't end up being that beneficial. Am I kind of understanding you correctly?
Yeah, I mean, I fundamentally believe that when it's done well, it all goes back, the old school principal negotiation strategy, right? Where throughout the entire cycle of analysis, sales cycle, whatever you want to call it, where you're working on the needs of each company, you're developing what it is you're going to deliver. You then get to the point at which you're negotiating the contract. That is actually a very, very final step. By the time you get there, in my view, you should have very clearly, jointly documented, this is all the stuff I need. This is all the stuff that is going to make it work for my business. This is all the stuff that I want, and that happens on both sides. There are here's all the stuff I'm willing to work with you and figure out. Here's some of the things I have to have, right? The non-negotiables. And I think that by the time you get to the contract, if those things are really, really clear, then a contract negotiation itself becomes really more about legal terms. It becomes about limitations of liability and those kind of caps and those kinds of things, which are legal issues, but the business terms are already laid out and agreed on by the time you get to that stage. And I think that makes for a much better relationship. It helps you have a framework in future dates when you go back to it, rather than pulling out the contract and reading through all the legalese. You go back to your business agreement and say, we both agreed we were going to do this. Are we doing that? And I think it makes for a long-term, much better relationship.
Yeah, that makes sense. Marcos, we're talking there about relationships, and we're talking about past precedent, right? Like Curt just mentioned. Like, hey, this is how we've always negotiated. Is it true that a lot of the ability to get to that point when you can tell the other side, hey, here's what I'm working with, that type of ability to be transparent, that comes with trust that you build to create that process and that consistency. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that is right, Matt. And one of the things that Curt called out there that I think sometimes is missed by folks is because they're not in that formal, call it legal review of T's and C's, or like, yeah, that's clearly in a negotiation, they maybe aren't as deliberate or rigorous or thoughtful in some of that more informal interaction. But if you do some of those things that Curt said around understanding needs on both sides of the table, shaping expectations, starting to frame out and get ahead of some of the problems and challenges, you have a foundation to fall back on when it comes to those sticking points. Because I think, Curt, you would agree, these types of complex deals, one of the challenges as you get into the final stages is that risk averse nature of people in negotiation. You have different functions weighing in here, be it IT, be it a commercial stakeholder, be it legal, procurement. You look at risk mitigation. Obviously, there's a lot of dollars being spent here. And, if it's a business critical element, there's also me putting my reputation or my ego on the line to push this across. So as all those things start to bubble up, if you haven't done some of that groundwork that Curt mentioned of managing and shaping the expectations in a deliberate way, you really could find yourself in trouble and in a lot of just spinning of your wheels and friction there at the end.
Prolonged negotiation, there's all kinds of things like that, but it isn't that easy to do. I mean, I think that it requires a lot of deliberate effort, which is why companies work with organizations like yours to teach their people where do you start? You start really early in the process. It takes a lot of deliberate effort to get to the stage that you have a really clear picture. And I think there comes a time when both parties agree that we are going to move forward and we want to negotiate a contract. That is the time for you to outline what have we all agreed to so far from a business perspective. What are the things that we said we want to deliver for you? What are your goals and objectives? What are the things that we're going to need to be able to do that? What's the duration of the contract? What are the what's the price? That have we talked about any sort of price? What does it include? All of those kinds of things that should, by this point, but before you ever pull a contract out and start negotiating it, you should have most of these things at least mostly agreed to. Because what's going to happen when you do get into the contract is there are going to be a lot of new people introduced. Right? All the people that Marcos mentioned. The IT people need to figure out, are you going to break any of their security policies? Procurement people are actually paid and bonused on getting your price lower than it is right now.
Mm-hmm.
And can you afford to do that? Did you leave any room in your contract to be able to do that? And I think it's really critically important for you to understand in a complex cycle like this that you're going to be dealing with all kinds of different people, lots of different people from different perspectives. In some cases, you've got IP lawyers, you've got commercial lawyers, you've got, tax and other types of lawyers that are getting involved. And each of them have their own set of protections that they're trying to work on. And so if you haven't agreed to and laid out a clear framework that both parties have said, yes, that's what I want in terms of the business, it just convolutes all of those other conversations you're having, because you end up having to go back to business terms saying, but wait a minute, we're trying to achieve this IT, whatever thing that you're trying to enforce on me can't be met if we're trying to achieve this business objective. Sometimes that happens. And so if you haven't laid out the business objectives, it's very hard to negotiate the finer points with all the various departments because you don't have kind of your objectives in mind.
Well, I mean, if I'm understanding you right, are you saying, Curt, that sometimes attorneys can make things more difficult? No, I don't.
Oftentimes it isn't the attorneys that I'll be honest with you, it is oftentimes not the attorneys. Procurement, IT, even the business themselves don't have clarity on what they're after. The attorneys are there to just simply protect the organizations, right? And they are very rarely the biggest problem in a negotiation.
Oh, interesting. Okay, fair enough. The the resounding thing that I'm taking away, and by the way, that's my favorite part of being a host on this podcast is, I learn so much every single time. The biggest thing that I'm taking away is like setting that groundwork and that foundation early. And that makes sense even if you think about it conceptually, because if for the first 3 months of our business relationship, I'm behaving in X way and communicating in X way. Then all of a sudden we get into a negotiation and I flip the script, either good or bad. We don't have that foundation laid for that trust, right? So if I'm understanding what Marcos and both you said, Curt, it's that consistency of how we're approaching that person to build that framework. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you don't actually get to the framework if you haven't built that level of trust with the kind of economic buyer on the side of the customer. You've got to have somebody on that side who's going to own it, sign it, pay for it, who is willing to agree to the objectives that both parties are trying to achieve. And if you don't have that, you're going to have a difficult negotiation.
Like herding a group of cats, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Marcos, did you have some thoughts on that point you wanted to share? Not the cat
Yeah,
part, the other
well,
stuff.
Kurt, I wanted to go deeper on one thing you said because I think it's a really interesting one, and I would love to just hear your thoughts and your experience on how this has gone either well or maybe gone poorly. It's that whole idea of when do you start to socialize price or cost in these conversations, right? There's a certain qualification, obviously, of need and of fit and those type of discussions. But sometimes folks tend to shy away from that big focal point, which is what's this thing going to cost? And how you initially handle that, of course, sets a table for the squeeze that comes later on. So just curious on what you've seen on the pricing front there of what's worked or what hasn't when it comes to socializing that.
Yeah, I think it depends, very much on the kind of thing you're selling. But in my view, the price needs to come out really, really early, right? Even if you're setting the stage for, my standard pricing is X, and the kinds of things I'm willing to offer discounts for are, you know, timing, volume, whatever it is that your organization is willing to allow you to do. And I think it's really important to lay the groundwork up front, which basically says, look, if you're buying one of my things, here's the price, right? If you're buying 100,000 of my things, I've got some flexibility to work with you on that, but you've got to be clear about what it is that you're after, and that will allow me to then set the price appropriately. And I think that the idea of just kind of, the price just kind of is magically appears out of nowhere, and it gets negotiated against, no real basis of why it would be negotiated. It's now cheaper because I want it to be cheaper, and there's no basis for it. That actually will screw up your negotiation really badly, because basically what it is signaling to the buyer is that you'll discount for whatever they ask, right? You're willing to do anything to earn their business, even taking a loss on it. And instead, I think it's really important, set the price up front, allow them to understand the things that you are able to discount on, volume, timing, all those kinds of things, whatever it may be. And that if they're able to articulate to you those things, that allows you to set the price at the number that they need, right? Or at least go back and ask for.
To somebody like myself who hasn't been involved in thousands, if not tens of thousands of negotiations like both of you, it just seems to me that that would also go a long way towards establishing some trust, right? Talking early in the beginning, like, because everybody knows that price is going to be a topic. It has to be, right? That's one of the things we're negotiating. And so, in a lot of folks' minds, probably one of the top ones. And so I think to get that out early in my brain has some value in that transparency and trust. Is that right?
No doubt. There's a, one really hard tactic, but it's really important to try and do, is if you can get your buyer to share with you kind of where the price needs to be, right?
Yeah.
How much money are you willing to spend to solve this problem? If I know what that is, I can tell you whether or not I can do it, right? If I don't know what that is, then it's all a lot of guesswork in trying to establish what it is. So I really do believe the earlier you put your price out there, the earlier you begin to establish kind of a rapport with the customer. Say, well, you're in the ballpark, and I know that I know that I can get you to come down on your price for these various things. If I know that, then I think we're working towards the same goal. If they don't know any of those things, and you get through a bunch of evaluation and you spend a whole bunch of time, and then you throw a number out there that's completely out of the ballpark, then you've not only destroyed trust, you've wasted a lot of people's time.
That makes perfect sense. And going back to that relationship and talking about, like you said, playing that guessing game, so to speak, where nobody knows anything. Marcos, you've talked in the past about some strategies of making or trying to understand the value to the other side as being an important part of that. Can you speak about that for a minute?
Yeah, I think Kurt alluded to it, Matt. If you can, through questioning, through testing some of your assumptions early on in the process, get to a point where you understand certain elements at the other side's values and other ones where they may be more flexible, it just helps you approach them with a much more practical and realistic offer. I think one of the struggles, if you don't do that well, is you're kind of guessing, and you may be, positioning something that you think is important to the other side, but in the end, it really isn't, and that can be a mismatch that's really important. I think another thing that Curt mentioned that's music to our ears, Matt, this, is this whole concept of conditional trading, right? Putting those breadcrumbs out there with the other side of, if you're able to do these things for me, that will unlock flexibility on things like cost here for you. So, what we always preach on these things is, don't make assumptions. Don't just guess at what these things are. Like, I'll give you an example, Matt. Right now, payment terms are a huge sticking point. And maybe where I was dealing with Curt 5 years ago and he was more flexible on payment terms, today it's going to be more of a fight on what payment terms we land on. So you got to vet that out, and don't just go based on assumptions or prior history.
That makes perfect sense. And the I've heard that come through a few times in this podcast, which is like, don't assume value to the other party's levers or drivers, right? Something that may have high value to us may have very little to medium value to them. And so sometimes we can use that to our advantage, right? Giving them something that they perceive to be high value, but really doesn't have that much value to us. Is that right?
But I also think one of the things that I think is really important, and Marcos, when you were talking about payment terms, it just made me think of this. One of the things that I find people who are not that experienced at negotiating do quite frequently, and you
this
have
guy
to really help them learn how to do that, which is, you need to take account of the things that you have given on, right? So something like payment terms, just like you said, Matt, may not be something that is really a big issue for me. I might have a fair amount of flexibility on it, but it's really important to them. If I give on that, I need to make sure that I account for that, because that is still something that I've given to them. And in every negotiation, particularly if you're trying to get to a win-win relationship, everything is a give to get. I give that, and in exchange for that, you need to give me something that I need that's really important to me. And I think that inexperienced negotiators do a really, really bad job of keeping accountable the things they've given and why they've given them.
And so, wait, did you say inexperienced negotiate? No, Marcos, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to pull back that one more layer with Curt. I completely agree with everything you said about claiming value and getting something conditionally for what you give. I think the other thing is, sometimes those gives, they can be intangible. They can be qualitative in nature. They don't have to be maybe a hard and fast thing like dollars or volume or terms. So I'm just curious, Curt, if you've seen any interesting elements of a contract that may be intangible, may be qualitative, but ended up being something that maybe unlocked or provided a lot of value to one side or the other.
That's a great question.
Yeah, there's a lot of them. I think that, I think a lot about how does in my case, I'm always thinking about software. How is the software that we're going to deploy for them? How does this get used in their business? How are they going to go through the change management process to make it useful in their business? What is the real time frame in which that software can become valuable to them? What you have to think about, what are the real business terms on their side that actually matter? And what a lot of people go into negotiations like this is they say, I'm selling you this software. The software costs $100, and you give me $100, I'm going to give you that software, and I want you to go figure out how to use it. Instead, in many cases, particularly when you're talking about enterprise software, it isn't so clear cut, right? I'm working in a business today at Ford where, I'm selling, for example, to Pizza Hut or somebody like that. They're rolling this stuff out to thousands and thousands of stores. They can't roll it out to thousands of stores at once, right? So it's going to take time for them to get there. So how can I structure my contract and my relationship with them to allow us to capture value for our business at the same time that they capture value for their business? And that is oftentimes one of these intangible things. You basically say, look, I'm gonna parse this contract out over the first year such that as I'm working with you to roll these things out, I'm growing the value of the contract over time versus saying, pay me the whole thing up front and we'll go figure out how you get value. That's a way that you not only build trust with your customer, you build these durable relationships with your customer because you're helping them match the spend with the value they're getting from it. And it also allows you to learn a little bit about how their business is going to work. So as you're rolling these things out, you're also learning quite a bit about what's working, what's not, and you can begin to adjust. You might find, and I have many, many times, you might find in the process of doing that they didn't buy a component or they didn't add things that they're actually going to need to make this work really well for their business. Something you may not have known and they may not have known at the onset. And so you can go back to them and say, hey, why don't we restructure a part of this thing to incorporate the parts of this, whatever, other components of software or other services components that are going to make this work better for you going forward. You can capture more money sometimes. You can oftentimes help a customer have a much, much better experience by doing this. So these are things that you have to think about when you're negotiating your contract because it's never just binary, right? It's never a yes, I'm going to do the deal. Here's my paper, sign it and use it. It doesn't really work that way, particularly with complex deals.
Yeah. So like what I'm hearing is that using the length of the contract, to not only build a better relationship, but maybe even extract more value. Plus, if possible, be one of those intangible items, right? Not the hard and fast, like here's what we need up front, but keeping it even open to, like you said, Curt, items that maybe they didn't think they needed, but now they need, and there's more value for one side or the other. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, probably both, right? If it's something they need, probably both companies would gain additional value by adding those things in.
Marcos, have you seen examples of that too with some of the folks that you've been coaching of not thinking about necessarily the hard and fast items, but more call it from a 3,000-foot view of like, let's look at the big picture?
Yeah, no, we do, Matt. And I think Curt did a good job of painting the picture here of being flexible. I think sometimes we make an agreement and there's a desire to solve it all on the first bite, and you don't have complete information. So if you solve it in a way that no longer works for one side or the other, it can be kind of a bear. So when you can build in some of that flexibility, or when you can come back to the table to problem solve and to creatively, overcome these, that is, I think, what really leans into Curt's message of durable, not only contracts or agreements, but durable relationships. And really important, I think Curt has painted this picture as well. Being a good partner or being durable doesn't mean I say yes to everything you want me to do, but it does mean I hear you, I listen to what is priority, and I bring you some solutions of what unlocks ways for me to meet those things that are important to you. So there has to be that conditional give and get there that Curt mentioned to make this really shine.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So Curt, before we, kind of wrap up, and I want to hear a bit about what's going on over at Fourth or any other projects you might want to talk about. I because you've been in the software space for as long as you have, sometimes I ask this question, sometimes I don't, but I do want to hear it from you. I will preface it by saying it's about AI. I will preface it by saying that the answer that any of us know about AI today could change by the time we get off this podcast. So, so this is strictly an opinion, but I'd love to hear your opinion about AI as it relates to negotiations. You can take that in any direction you want. Is it ethical? Is it effective? Is it coming? Is it too much of an art versus a science to include? Anything you want to talk about related to AI, I would love to hear.
No, AI is coming. It's coming like a freight train, so you better get yourself prepared for that.
Yes, sir.
I think I think that AI is an amazing tool. I've had the opportunity to work for a pure play AI software company and saw some of the most brilliant AI minds in the world build really, really advanced AI type systems that can do things that you just never really thought you'd be able to do. But leveraging the power of machine learning, leveraging the power of neural networks and things like that, you can do some very, very interesting things. So with respect to, is negotiation too much of an art? It absolutely is not. I think that what AI will do for us going forward is it will allow us to solve some of the easy things very quickly. I think this is going to come now, if not like in the immediate future, which is think of all of those legal terms that get negotiated back and forth. One side sends over, what I want is an unlimited limitation of liability. And what you send back is, well, what I'm willing to give you is this much. And, that goes back and forth 2 or 3 times. It takes a lot of time and a lot of brain damage on the part of the lawyers to kind of map out what are the implications of all of these things for other parts of the contract. AI can do that kind of stuff really, really well. It can also look back in your history and see what precedents you've had as a company, what have you allowed, and allow the lawyers to make decisions. Was that a good decision I made in the past? Is it something I'd be willing to do now? If so, they can tell it, go for it. And the AI can go ahead and close out on a whole lot of those types of terms. With respect to business terms and timing and things like that, I think that AI can truly help by looking at similar types of projects. So in the case of software, one of the challenges everybody always has is how long is this going to take? And what is the right sequence of things that work best? How do I capture value early in the deployment versus later in the deployment? All these kinds of things are information that you could feed into machine learning models and have it actually spit out these kinds of structured project plans that are specific to your business, your software products, and your customer experiences thus far, and help the customers kind of see this is the path to go down. And by the way, these are the things you're going to need to be successful. Make sure you bring that into the negotiation. That's actually going to help all of us because it's just going to be very historically based, not just me standing in front of them saying, you really, really need that support. Right? So I think that those kinds of things will come really quickly and they'll be very valuable for us. I also think that using things like ChatGPT and things like that, you can leverage that to help you craft language that might be tricky. But sometimes trying to solve particularly tricky problems, I know we all think that we're the first people who've ever had to do this on the planet, but probably we're not. And it's likely that these types of contracts exist out there, and somebody might have already gone through all the brain damage to think through how do I write this language out to make it work for somebody and understandable and in a contract that people can actually read and understand and follow. Can help with a lot of that kind of thing as well. I think you can do that today.
So really kind of like, I mean, aside from what it's even marketed as, but in negotiations, taking these large batches of information that might not even need to be redone or repeated and categorizing that and kind of quantifying it. Marcos, at the Maker Group, we're involved with some of that project with our negotiation software, Maker Connect. And so can you just talk a minute about AI as it relates to your thoughts on negotiations?
Yeah, I think Curt hit some interesting points there, and certainly some of the path that we're on. Curt, we're envisioning a future as it's your co-pilot to do some of that heavy lifting. We're playing with things like putting a contract into the system and pulling out all the relevant things that may be variables that are negotiable, and starting to call those out as where do you see the value on these. I think another key place in planning, Curt, you mentioned. In the early phases of a deal, what about research, right? If you're dealing with a public company or even, maybe a high profile client, you can start to digest, what are they saying out in the press? What are things that they've been talking about? And you can get to some really clear things. Another thing we're playing with too is around communication. Here are the maybe dozen of, half baked or not well wordsmithed things that I want to communicate to the other party. Help me coalesce these into 3 or 4 key pillars that are more digestible. So there's a lot of things you can do if you guide the AI in the right direction. I think we're a ways, Matt, from it being a robot versus robot negotiation. But to Kurt's point, that stuff that he's talking about, the stuff that we're doing, is not years away. It's on our doorstep. So that's where we are today.
Fair enough. And I'll just say this one last thing. It's just a little tongue in cheek, I guess, about AI. But there was a LinkedIn post, I've mentioned it a couple times, a couple weeks ago, where there's a big construction crew building a big building. And right on the corner, it's a huge building. They wrapped, instead of Tyvek, they had a big sign that said, "Hey, Chat GPT, come finish this building." So it's important to remember that while it is good at quantifying these large data sets, there is still some humanity involved and some art involved in this as well. So Curt, I'd love to close this out here by having you chat a bit about, looks like you've been at Forth for about 4 months. And I'd love to have you chat about what they do, what kind of projects are involved in, any of the above.
Yeah. So Forth is a really interesting business. It's like a lot of private equity backed companies. It's made up of several different companies that were very successful in their particular markets. Forth serves the restaurant, retail, and hotel industries, so kind of hospitality broadly, and provides software that solves your labor and productivity problems. So hiring people, as you all know, trying to eat in restaurants right after COVID, it was very difficult. Forth solves that problem and helps you do all of the scheduling of those resources. We do inventory management, tracking, and for segments of the business, we also do HR, payroll, and benefits.
Okay.
For companies that, similar to like an ADP type of thing, for certain types of companies with a specialization on hourly workers that are working in these kind of hospitality industries, hospitality and retail industries. So the business is doing very well. As I said, it was made up of companies that were the top of their markets. So in the UK, the company Forth, where the name comes from, is practically every single restaurant, and 9 of the 10 top luxury hotels in the city of London are all running our inventory management product. So
wow.
Really a very big market share. In the U.S., the company name was Hot Schedules. So it's a very well-known name. Just about every restaurant you walk into, the people working there are either using Hot Schedules or have used Hot Schedules in another job. And it's every name, every logo you see driving down the street is running the product. We also do inventory management with a product that was developed in Australia, and it's deployed literally all over the world. Every KFC in China, just literally everywhere. This inventory management product is helping restaurants to manage their recipes, all the data about their recipes, and all the associated inventory and distribution that they need to make that work. So it's a really interesting business. I think I've spent so much of my life eating in restaurants and staying in hotels that I find it just fascinating. That we're out here solving the problems that help those companies run more efficiently and more effectively. And it's been a really, really fun and interesting first 4 months to kind of get embedded into the middle of this business, which is everywhere you look.
Yeah, it almost sounds like, so if I am going to start up a restaurant or even a new hotel, for instance, it sounds like Forth. What was the other one called? Hot what?
Hot Schedules is one of our products. Hot Schedules is used for labor scheduling and productivity.
So, really, if a restaurant or hotel, if I'm starting one of those, kind of like the standard is to pick up the phone and get involved with Forth, right? Your team is kind of a one-stop shop for all of those core functions that are happening in that world. Is that a fair statement?
That's right. Yeah. Well, you need to hire staff, onboard these people, get them into the scheduling system. And we use AI pretty pervasively across our business. So you mentioned it related to negotiation, but it is, as you can imagine, forecasting is a perfect use case for AI. So using forecasting to figure out what staff I need on hand, what kind of product I need on hand, make sure that I'm properly. I have plenty of hamburgers and buns for 4th of July. So those kinds of things is really very important. And I've got enough people in the restaurant at the right times to make sure that I'm able to service my customers and make the most money I can.
Wow, and that actually sounds pretty all inclusive. Marcos, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, two thoughts. One, on behalf of hospitality guests everywhere, please continue to just drive efficiency into the system. It's needed. And I think two,
Yep.
that space is having to reinvent itself, post pandemic, and with the new ways of working and new ways of people, eating and traveling, et cetera. So, our clients that play in that space are looking for all the solutions they can get to drive efficiencies and to make sense of this new world. So, love to see where you're going there, Curt.
Yeah, that's great. We're happy to talk to any of them. Come across somebody who would need it. We'd love to talk to them.
And I think I pulled it up here. So it actually is fourth.com, FOURTH, fourth.com. Is that correct?
That's right.
Cool. All right. Any closing thoughts, either from you, Marcos, or you, Curt?
I just want to thank Curt on behalf of both of us. Really, really great conversation, Curt. Learned a lot.
Yeah, same thing. Thanks for inviting me on. I really appreciate you guys having me. It's a great conversation, and good luck with the podcast.